Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. Thank you all for your presence here today in this Post-COP28 briefing. My name is Pedro Venzon, and I'm International Policy Advisor at IETA, and I will be the moderator of this meeting. Today, we are going to provide updates on the outcomes of COP28 in terms of key announcements on carbon markets and also about Article 6 negotiations. As you might know, parties weren't able to reach consensus on the texts for Article 6.2 and 6.4, and we plan to discuss why this happened and what could be the impacts of such outcome. We will start with a brief overview from COP28, highlights and key announcements related to both Article 6 and the voluntary carbon markets, and also carbon markets developments. After our International Policy Director, Andrea Bonzanni, will take us through the Article 6 texts and the different positions between parties to set the scene for the discussion with our guest speakers. And finally, we will count on the expertise of the chair of Article 6.4 supervisory body, Olga Gassan-zade, and the Swedish Article 6 negotiators, David Newell, the CEO of IETA, Dirk Forrister, the CEO of Resilient, Lisa DeMarco, and the IETA International Working Group co-chair, Audrey Goldstein, to discuss the COP28 outcomes. At the end, we will have space for Q&A, so I would like to invite you to write down your questions over this meeting so that we can discuss them with the panelists after. So without further ado, let's jump into our brief overview of COP28. So COP28 was the largest COP to date with over 80,000 participants and a full agenda encompassing thousands of scheduled meetings and events. So it was really interesting to see how climate change is becoming a really important discussion into the global agenda. In terms of announcements, I would say that before a global stocktake, one announcement that's important to highlight also was basically the approval and operationalization of the Lost and Damaged Fund, which was discussed at last COP. So on its very first day, we had this approval with commitments totaling an impressive $750 million. So I think this is a really important step forward to actively address loss and damage caused by climate change. As you know, the main highlight of this conference was the first global stocktake, which clearly demonstrated an ambition gap and culminated in what became known as the UAE consensus, where for the first time parties agree on expressing their willingness to transition away from fossil fuels in energy systems. The idea is on a just, orderly, and equitable transition, accelerating action within this critical decade, with the goal to achieve net zero by 2050, and being aligned with scientific recommendations. So beyond that, I think it's also important to highlight some announcements. The Oil and Gas Decarbonization Charter. So 50 oil and gas companies agreed to reach net zero methane emissions and end flaring in operations by 2030. There were also extensive discussions on the mitigation work program, just transition work program, regarding unilateral trade measures such as CBAM, which is something that we want also to be more discussed into this events and conference, so that we can better prepare for this and also support in this process to adapt to this mechanism. In terms of global renewables and energy efficiency, there was a pledge by 123 countries. It was a voluntary commitment to tripling renewable energy generation by 2030. Also, there was the presentation of the core framework for the Energy Transition Accelerator and the launch of the new website and signatories to the Global Carbon Pricing Challenge with IETA is cross-secretariat together with Adelphi. So if we move to the next slide, I'd like to briefly highlight a bit of what happened in our business hub. So basically, we had over 100 side events, private briefings, networking events. There were 58 side events that were live streamed, and all these events are available online. We will share this presentation with you after the meeting, so you can, if you want to check out these side events, I would like to invite you to do so. There were thousands of participants, and also I think one important aspect to highlight is, although the challenging of reaching consensus on Article 6, I think we can see through the participation in our business hub how the momentum for carbon markets is high, and we expect this to continue over 2024. If we move to the next slide, I would like to briefly go through some announcements in terms of carbon markets. So there were multiple Article 6 MOUs and bilateral and implementing agreements. As you can see here on the screen, there were 9 new agreements during COP28. So we saw MOUs between Morocco and Norway, Rwanda, Kuwait also signing with Singapore, Fiji, Senegal, and Costa Rica also signing with Singapore. There was an implementation agreement signed between Papua New Guinea and Singapore, and a bilateral agreement between Switzerland, Chile, and Switzerland and Tunisia. There were also some interesting developments in terms of national and regional frameworks. So Rwanda launched its carbon market framework with a focus on Article 6. Vietnam also announced its pilot mandatory carbon credit program for 2025, and also announced that it's expected to become operational by 2028. We saw Egypt also launching a Pan-African voluntary carbon market. ECOWAS also announced the launch of a standardized carbon market. Turkey also expressed interest in moving forward with its ETS, with the announcement of the first pilot phase for 2025. And Nigeria, which already expressed interest in developing an eventual ETS in the country during last COP, also appointed a special committee to draft its national carbon market strategy. I'll not go to all these other bullet points here on this slide, but of course you are more than welcome to discuss this with us after, if you want to know more about each one of these announcements. So if we move to the next slide, also there were some interesting developments in terms of the voluntary carbon market. We saw a joint statement from independent crediting programs, which was facilitated by IETA, so to amplify the impact of carbon markets in achieving real mitigation and supporting countries implementing Article 6 and their indices. We saw joint efforts also from META standards, so SBTi, also GHG protocol, ICVCM, VCMI, among others, to promote end-to-end high integrity framework with an ambition about how each of them can play, with an animation actually about how each of them can play a complementary role in supporting more ambitious climate action. And I would like also to highlight the launching of some important initiatives. So here you can see the launch of the CAD Trust data dashboard. I think actually it's not mentioned here in this slide, but this was an important announcement at COP. Also, a bit before COP, we saw the VCMI launching its claims code of practice, and VERHA also launched its consolidated methodology for RED+. So we tend to share the presentation with you after, with links to further information about these announcements, but I would like to invite you, of course, to reach out in case you want to discuss more any of these points. So with that, I would like to give the floor to our International Policy Director, Andrea Bonzanni, to take us through the Article 6 discussions at COP28. Andrea, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Pedro. Here on this slide, there's a lot of text summarizing the key points for discussion and what the main disagreements were. I will not go through these points one by one. I like to keep this short and leave more time for the Q&A part of this webinar. I see there are already 2 questions. What I will say is that whilst the subject of the negotiation revolved around very technical and operational details, we saw some very political tensions brewing underneath. And we said in our pre-COP briefing that we hoped that Article 6 would avoid extreme politicization, but that probably did not happen. And that's one of the reasons why we had an unsuccessful outcome and no text on both 6.2 and 6.4. On 6.2, the main point for contention was around the vision of what a cooperative approach is and what it should look like. So as you can see, it's a very fundamental question. And we had the EU supported by ILAC and AOSIS, so if some Latin American countries and the small island states, and they tried to introduce through several elements, such as a definition of cooperative approach or rules around the sequencing of the various reports and authorization. They tried to introduce a more central oversight and control over party-to-party cooperative approach. And this was opposed strongly by the umbrella group and by the LMDC, the like-minded developing countries. So while this tension was not resolved, we had very different texts being published. The longest text was 55 pages and the shortest was 6, if I'm not wrong, just to show how much the text changed throughout the 2 weeks, but it was not possible to reach an agreement. Another key point on contention, and this is cross-cutting between 6.2 and 6.4, was around the nature of the international registry. So in Glasgow, it was agreed that there would be a mechanism registry from 6.4. Each party can have its own party registry or registries. And the UNFCCC would also implement an international registry for countries that do not have or do not want to have their own national registry. Whether this registry will be a fully fledged transactional registry or just a tracking instrument was very contentious. It was a matter discussed last year as well in Sharm el-Sheikh, and there was no progress this year. The US, at least openly only supported by Australia, was strongly against the idea of developing a transactional international registry, whereas groups such as the African group and the LMDCs would like to have that because they probably see the international registry as their registry of choice when they plan to use Article 6. On 6.4, the items on the agenda were fewer, and you see them listed here on the right-hand side of this slide. On emission avoidance and conservation enhancement and authorization, it looked like compromise was achieved, but then the main sticky point was the adoption of the 2 recommendations from the supervisory body, the one with requirements for methodologies and the one with additional requirements for removals. And here we had the EU and the Coalition for Rainforest Nations, for very different reasons, strongly against the adoption of the removals recommendation. We had in the first session we had earlier today, we had Perumal from the Secretariat. He informed us that it might have been possible to find a compromise with CFRN, whereas the EU was more firm in their opposition, and they view, that was expressed very clearly towards the end of the 2 weeks, was a separation of the fate path for the two recommendations. They supported full adoption of the one for methodologies, but not no adoption for removals, and this was opposed adamantly by Saudi Arabia, represented the LNDCs. So in the end, we also had then other parties expressing the rejection of their recommendations in the final meetings. Some brought up issues around human rights. The UK rejected the 6.2 text because of concerns around the potential unilateral revocation of authorization. But I feel all these matters, if there had been an agreement overall, these matters would not have raised. It was the ones mentioned here were the ones that really could not could not be solved. So what happens next? And then I'll stop. The COP invited parties to continue discussion on the same mandates throughout 2024. So the next meeting will be SB 16 Bonn in June. And it also invited the 6.4 supervisory body to get on with the operationalization of the mechanism. Well, of course, and we have Olga, the chair of the supervisory body here. It remains to be seen what the SB would focus on, what it will prioritize, and what the agenda would really look like. So I will stop here, hand back to Pedro, and happy to come back in the Q&A.
Thank you, Andrea, for such an insightful presentation and set the scene for the discussion. So with that, as you already mentioned, we have the chair of the Article 6.4 supervisory body, and I would like to start with you, Olga. It's a pleasure to have you with us. Also, I would like to thank you for all your hard work this year over the supervisory body meetings and also during the negotiations. We really appreciate all your work. We are following closely all these meetings and trying to help you in this process. But we know that it's challenging and it's not easy to reach consensus, as it became really clear at COP28. So I would like to ask you about what's your perception of the negotiations this year? So what were the main challenges, and why do you think the parties could not overcome this challenge during COP28? And also, considering your involvement into this Article 6.4 supervisory body, it would be great to understand a bit more what you are expecting for the next year in terms of how do you expect also the supervisory body playing a role for us to reach a different outcome next COP.
Thank you, Pedro. Thank you, Andrea, very much for the invitation. It's hard for me to answer because I was not present at the negotiations as SB chair. SB chair doesn't have a formal role at the negotiations. I was there as a negotiator with a party flag. Of course, we had positions, and we were taking active part in the negotiations. I think maybe I can start with the reflections on the SB and sort of the outcome for the SB, and then if you're interested, I can offer some insights as a negotiator as well. So when it comes to the SB, we do have a procedural conclusion. Nobody has seen it yet from the COP president, CMA president to be more correct, that SB is encouraged to continue operationalization and continue deliberation of the recommendations for submission at the next CMA. So that work will continue. how exactly it will continue, considering that no text was agreed, although several priorities were discussed, is to be seen. I think those parties that have blocked the adoption of the SB text, no, the SB decisions, but we assumed that they had a plan, and they are also SB members. We will find out when we arrive at the first SB meeting, what they had in mind. As a negotiator, I can say that the key difference really is in the attempts of, and then I think it's the key issue why the negotiations collapsed for both 6.2 and 6.4 was attempts by some of the parties to renegotiate the tenets of the Paris Agreement and of the Glasgow Accords. With the package, I think it was Glasgow package, right? Because what parties have decided in Paris is that there will be a multilateral mechanism like 6.4, but there will be also a party-driven mechanism like 6.2, which will be independent of the UN interference, not necessarily supervision, but interference, in the sense that you would not be able to block how things are progressing under that mechanism the same way as the decisions have been blocked this year, for example. And that there's a fundamental difference in the philosophies of the parties that are approaching implementation of these mechanisms. So with these issues unresolved, it's still hard to foresee how this will continue.
Thank you, Olga. So maybe since I think David is joining us a bit after, I would like to go to Dirk, our CEO. So I think you have expressed a disappointment with Paris not achieving consensus on Article 6 at COP28. And also, I think this was a lost opportunity to increase integrity and promote carbon markets more broadly as a key instrument for us to achieve our climate commitments. So I would like to understand, considering the challenging year of 2024, where we will have a supervisory body working to further develop the recommendations and eventually the tools that they need to develop it. But at the same time, I think at IETA, we always emphasize this interplay between markets. So I would like to understand how these affect carbon markets more broadly, and also how IETA is planning to support in this process.
Thanks, Pedro. I guess I'm, having watched a lot of these things over the years, I'm somewhat philosophical about this, because I think we have a lot of room to work in bilateral or plurilateral settings on cooperation under 6.2. And we don't actually need a whole lot more from the process. The folks that are trying to complicate it or put it under the more close supervision by the UN, I think are going down the wrong path, because and Olga, you might agree with this or not, I don't know, but I sort of feel like the process needs the discipline of people being able to work together under 6.2, or otherwise 6.4 might never make decisions. They need a little bit of a competitive threat from the ability of countries to go do their own thing. And I think that's what's going to happen in the near term, is we're going to start seeing, and we're going to encourage that, and we're going to collaborate with countries that are interested in those models. And the 6.4 process will just have to catch up with it. It'll have to accommodate what countries decide to do bilaterally. So I think this was, in a sense, for those that were kind of pushing so hard to try to get more control over those, bilateral arrangements, I think they may have fumbled because it was not in the cards to come away with that. And they were kind of blaming the mood music coming from voluntary carbon markets, completely different things. And I think again, they were trying to manipulate that public discourse in a way that fit a negotiating agenda. And what I hate is that it's the EU, right? They're traditionally our best friends on markets, but I feel like they lost the plot on it. Frankly, if I'm being really blunt, now it's our job just to move ahead, and we'll work with the Japanese-led Article 6 implementation partnership. We'll work with our BPMI program that Andrea and Pedro are involved in, and collaborating with governments that want to set up systems. And I think we'll also want to work on some of our existing strongholds in the OECD countries to encourage them to start elaborating how they plan to integrate in the international flexibilities, because getting to net zero, we don't have time to screw around anymore. That's the problem, and that's the real disappointment in it. But it's not the first time, right? That's what's sad about it. It's sort of like reverted to old methods, and so my perspective is onward and upward, and finally the real victim in it, in my mind, is the 6-4 mechanism, because it needed a burst of energy coming out of this COP, and it didn't get it. So that's unfortunate. So how did I do, Pedro? Did I answer the question you wanted?
Thank you, Dirk. That's great. And I completely agree. I think we need to emphasize that Article 6.2 is already happening, and we need to work to promote more integrity in the market through these agreements that are already happening. So providing clarity how this can be done in the most efficient way, but also with high integrity. Lisa, I would like to go to you now, and I know that you follow really closely Article 6 negotiations, and we were discussing over this last 2 weeks, considering the polarization in the room. So I would like to hear from you, like, what's your assessment of this outcome at COP, or this lack of outcome at COP? Like, how do you think that this also would affect eventually the VCM, since like many have been pointing out that Article 6.4 could represent a benchmark for integrity. So I would like to understand, like, what's your assessment of this COP in terms of Article 6, and also like the impacts for other markets such as the voluntary carbon market.
Thanks very much, Pedro. I would certainly agree with Dirk in that it's unfortunate that there was no 6.4 text, because it definitely needed the boost to operationalize there. I also view quite strongly that outcome as being not the most principled. Certainly it was apparent to me as a longstanding Article 6 nerd that from day one, there was an attempt to block on the basis of issues that were most certainly attempts to not just renegotiate Paris and Glasgow, but also to renegotiate clear decisions that the same parties had taken in Sharm el-Sheikh last year. So from that perspective, I think Article 6.2 is definitely straightforward, full steam ahead. We have what we need, but some of the positions taken notionally under the guise, and I'm going to have to emphasize the word guise, of environmental integrity, are likely to have a negative impact, in my view, on environmental integrity and consolidation of the markets. I think we'll see a bigger push towards voluntary carbon markets, and in particular towards standards like the ICVCM, the VCMI on use, and overarching market integrity frameworks like those for the trading and broad principles that are being issued by the G7 Carbon Markets Platform, as well as IOSCO and other securities regulators. So instead of getting the standardization and integrity that we do need and continue to want to see throughout the marketplace, we got enhanced fragmentation on the basis of a very neo-colonial view of which standard was best and who should be imposing their standards on other people. So on other jurisdictions, and that's contrary to the intent of Paris Agreement, the bottom-up approach, and in particular in relation to Article 6, which provides for independent crediting. And in the room, it got quite heated by traditionally calm folks, to the point where simple things that you think would have been absolutely obvious, that could have been decided upon, like adoption of the draft agreed electronic format for submission of data, to provide for ongoing reporting. We've been using this draft form since Sharm el-Sheikh last year. Even that couldn't be agreed. So there was a bit of a hostage taking in the room, and it wasn't pleasant to sit through. In terms of BCM impacts, let me just briefly say, I think you'll see actually an uptick in the voluntary carbon markets to fill the void that was left by the absence of decision. So let me conclude that way and ask you again, like Dirk has, have I properly answered your question?
Sure, thank you, Lisa. I think it's really important for us to listen from experts like you and understand a bit more like all this complex landscape about carbon markets and ensure that we are understanding well like the different movements of the market and the impacts that these decisions or lack of decisions can bring to markets. Then I would like to go to Audrey, our International Working Group co-chair. So Audrey, you are also involved into the CORSIA market, and I think it would be great to understand a bit more like your views about this COP28 and what the lack of clear guidance in terms of Article 6.2 would mean to this market. So particularly considering that CORSIA is entering also in a new phase, and eventually this would be important for the market, for the market confidence. But yeah, I think it's important to hear also from you that are already involved into the carbon market, the international carbon market, from the private sector perspective. What are the implications more broadly that you see as well?
Absolutely, thank you, Pedro. I think I wanted to start by saying that, so unfortunately I wasn't able to go to COP, but I think in a case like this where you can't reach an agreement, it does give a bit of perspective in that I guess it's a bit easier to see the silver lining when you haven't spent the 2 weeks of sleepless nights and tremendous effort on this. I think, as many of the previous speakers have mentioned, 6.4 is not dead. It's very easy to say we didn't reach an agreement. 6.2, 6.4 are dead. I think neither of them are dead. If anything, 6.4 is maybe kicked a bit further down the line. It gives the opportunity to hopefully reinforce further the guidance, the suggestions, and come back stronger next year. But 6.2, I think, is still the highlight in that it was already operational, right? And you mentioned CORSIA. I think more broadly, OIMP. I think it's worth highlighting that we are seeing the market finally coming to fruition in 6.2. We are seeing CORSIA hopefully go live next year. We are seeing parties that are starting to unilaterally issue letter of authorizations that are very favorable to this OIMP scheme, I guess, or mechanism. And so 6.2, if anything, is still going forward, but it's also the fact that there wasn't an agreement gives that opportunity to learn by doing, I guess, whether it's CORSIA, whether it's through players like Japan or Singapore, Switzerland, we saw it. There is still a lot of MOUs of tractions that has happened at COP around carbon markets in general, but Article 6.2 also in particular. And so those transactions will still happen. I don't think people will go back, or that I think during the initial impressions that there were conversations of, does that mean the rules for CORSIA will have to be changed? It's not my belief, it is not IETA's belief that it has to be changed, because the rules already enabled CORSIA to exist before this year, right? It does make certain things a bit more complicated, particularly the fact that there is still a bit of leniency in terms of what qualifies as a first transfer. You have a few technical aspects that are not blocking, but might open the door for basis risk in terms of contracts, in terms of terms. The fact that you will have different transactions that will be based on different criteria and definitions, because 6.2 were not able to agree on definitions this year. And so it's going to be interesting to see how that develops, how possibly we see best practice coming not from negotiations, but just by the actual implementation and the first transactions coming through, because there is an appetite to make that happen. So I think, well, everybody has this a bit gloom and doom perspective. I think it's worth noting that things are still going. Lisa was talking also about the fact that this might support VCM. We do get questions very often from the private sector as to what is the difference between 6.4 and VCM, right? And there is a difference, but you can use 6.4 for a similar purpose. In terms of at corporate level, you can use both, right? And the fact that 6.4 is delayed, as Lisa mentioned, means it gives an opportunity for VCM to reinforce. The fact that we will see 2024 is hopefully when initiatives like ICVCM, VCMI finally land, now that they've kind of finalized all the operationalization aspect, they can start implementing. So hopefully we will start seeing this lending support to VCM, and this hopefully can also be used as a way to give a bit of a support and push for 6.4, right? If you see a certain threshold for quality consensus on methodologies happening in VCM, there's nothing that prevents the SB from leveraging that and making their own work easier, right? So yeah, I think overall, it's really disappointing that we couldn't reach agreement. It does create a few, I guess, questions and uncertainty, but it's also an opportunity to set the pace and to see certain countries that want to see things happening and they are not actively trying to block it, to actually pave the way for the others. Thank you.
Thank you, Audrey. So I see that Olga has raised her hand. So if you want to jump into.
I just wanted to come back to what Audrey mentioned, because having had the experience of serving on the SB for 2 years and sharing the discussions over the last year, I think maybe there is a wrong impression in the VCM that 6.4 is going to be a copy of VCM. I think the differences of opinion, and there are definitely some MSB members and parties that have nominated them that see that 6.4 should be a very exclusive mechanism with very small supply. And in that sense, if you look into the discussions, both regarding the methodologies and regarding the removals, it's not necessarily that the experiences of ECM are taking into account, you know, in the removals to a certain degree, but I'd say in methodologies, quite on the contrary. I think it's more of a sort of rebuilding and rethinking and reimagining, which is a struggle, a fundamental, I think, is a philosophical struggle.
Thank you, Olga. Thank you for your comments. So I think David is with us. So I would like to ask him a question before coming back to you, Olga. I have a follow-up question and here in the chat. I think it will be interesting to hear your thoughts about this. But David, Sweden is already engaged in Article 6.2 agreement and moving forward with that. So how do you see that this lack of agreement at COP28 would eventually impact your initiatives, and what's our perception of these negotiations moving forward? I think it's also important to consider what we are expecting for next year, since there was disappointment this year. So how can we plan ahead and try to support also in the process for us to achieve a different outcome next year?
Thank you. Well, I appreciate the invitation, and I'm pleased to talk about this. First of all, I'll address Sweden's interest in engaging with 6.2. As you know, we're moving rapidly forward, engaging several countries in this, and we are full steam ahead in terms of 6.2. Of course, in the short term, I don't think it's problematic at all for 6.2 for engagement. I think countries can, of course, move forward on this. We have enough to move forward. There is, of course, as was mentioned earlier, the risk that whatever we report or what we do might or might not be in line with future guidance. And of course, we need the AEF in place ultimately to be able to report fully. But in terms of initial reports, we can, of course, engage in that when we report our authorizations, et cetera, according to our best interpretations. When it comes to the negotiation, speaking in terms of Sweden, and of course, as a member of the EU negotiating group, I think this is kind of taking a step back and looking at where we are right now in the macro picture. The past couple of years have seen a massive loss in faith in the voluntary carbon markets. And this is because they have failed on many instances, maybe not all, not everything that makes the news is an example of failure, I think. I think we need to view these things with a critical eye. But of course, there are certainly some instances where there have been a failure of the carbon market, voluntary carbon markets, to deliver on quality, to deliver real emissions reductions that have real quality and that ultimately represent global emissions reductions. And because of that, I think money is looking for other places to invest. And I think Article 6 is viewed as kind of a hope for the future of carbon markets because it puts a UN stamp of approval on something. And in my opinion, I think this can go one of two ways when it comes to Article 6, addressing both 6.2 and 6.4. I think either it could go in the direction, if we're able to ensure integrity in these markets, if we're able to ensure that they function as they are intended and envisioned, then we're going to be able to back up that stamp of approval from a UN system with actual quality that's significantly better than what exists in the voluntary markets today. On the other hand, if we're not able to deliver that, I think it will kind of putter along for a number of years, even probably before the market catches on to the fact that this is not significantly different than what the voluntary market has delivered. It's not significantly better. And then, of course, there will be a loss of faith in Article 6 and in carbon markets probably more broadly, which poses a long-term risk. And so from Sweden and the EU's perspective, negotiating from, if we look at, again, both at 6.2 and 6.4 before I go into those, but just together, I think if we do not deliver on integrity in terms of real reductions, additionality, integrity of the system as a whole, then it's of course always a failure when we fail to reach agreement. It's always a disappointment. It's always a problem when we aren't able to reach consensus, of course. But from our perspective, in the long run, the real problem is going to be if we do not deliver on the promises of Article 6 and the markets later discover this and realize it on their own, that in the long run, this is not going to be beneficial for the market. It's not going to be sustainable in the long run if it doesn't deliver something qualitatively better than what's already available. And so this was most manifest in 6.4 in the removals guidance. We were fine, as has been mentioned, with the methodologies guidance. That was fine. It wasn't perfect, but it was fine, good enough. On the removals guidance, we felt that it was lacking. It was not specific enough. It did not address many of the issues that we're going to be putting out a paper soon on removals and the implications of removals and permanence and things like that should be coming out pretty soon. But we've seen the results of this, and it's raised serious concerns about the role of removals and different types of removals, projects, nature-based, technical, et cetera. And we were not comfortable putting through a guidance that, well, this would certainly let the market, continue and move forward quickly. In the long run, it would not ensure the integrity of the projects involved. And then when it comes to 6.2, I think we've actually, despite the fact that we failed to agree, I did notice around small, but significant progress in terms of understanding when it comes to revocation, for example, or authorization, small progress. Now, there's certainly some big differences there that remain to be overcome. But I think if we rush to do this and get it wrong, the risk of that in the long run is much greater than getting the market moving for the sake of getting it moving and not having something that has, significantly better quality than what's available. And if we say, well, we can let the private sector and other standards drive this, well, that's what they've been doing for the past many years in the voluntary markets, and we see where that's got us. They're learning and they're moving forward, they're improving, absolutely. But I think there's a role for the UN to play in this. And I think I'll stop there. I have, of course, a lot more to say about that, but I can stop there and we can move on to the next section or questions.
Thank you, David. So I see Olga. Do you want to comment on this, and Dirk as well? So maybe Olga first and then Dirk.
Yeah, I can, because I'm so blunt and straightforward that I can. I think as negotiators, we didn't see any attempts by the EU to address environmental integrity. What we saw are attempts to block the process, starting from attempts to first resolve the issue of issuance of units in the 6.4 registry, for example, transitioning units when they don't have letter of authorization, which are by birth MCUs. EU was blocking that. EU was blocking decisions on allowing countries to report transactions, which is contrary to environmental integrity that EU is claiming is their goal. We also saw that EU has pulled the text which provided for prioritization of sustainable development tool and appeals and grievance procedure and inclusive consultations with indigenous and local communities and consultation with scientific, technical, and practical communities. And all of this text was pulled with blunt text to continue work. This was not done in the name of environmental integrity. This was done for the only single purpose, not to allow SB to proceed with recommendations on removals, which are in conflict with EU domestic certification program. And specifically, EU has been requesting us to address definition of reversals. So let's not talk about environmental integrity, because this is not what it was about. There was specific request from the EU to change the definitions. That was the breaking point. And a number of countries have disagreed with the EU's attempts to mess with a complex negotiated package of recommendations that for the purposes of EU domestic policy. That was unacceptable for a whole lot of countries. So to say that this was done for the sake of environmental integrity is hypocritical. And I'm sorry, David, I don't know you, and I'm not addressing this to you. I'm addressing it to the EU general communication strategy, right? And then another issue that was brought was the issue of human rights, for God's sake, human rights was never mentioned even a single time in the E6.2 negotiating room. Not a single time in 2 weeks. And then to pull the decision and name human rights as the reason is beyond hypocritical, because human rights is not to be trivialized. Human rights is about protecting lives. In my country, people get killed, murdered, detained. Children get stolen from homes by invading savage army. Protecting human rights is important. It's not a bargaining chip to block a decision. And I'm sorry for getting emotional, but this is what we saw in negotiating room. And to have it excused as an attempt to safeguard environmental integrity is completely rewriting what has actually been happening.
Should I respond to that, Pedro? Is that a cue for me, or are we
Yeah.
moving on to other people? It's up to you.
If you want, David, but it's up to you.
Yeah, sure. No, that's fine. No, of course, I disagree with that interpretation. I think that's what certain parties may interpret the EU's actions as. Having sat in the groups where we've discussed this at the EU level, in between every session, in working together in our texts, in our discussions, that's not where we're coming from. And we are, I mean, you can question whether it's about environmental integrity or something else. Of course, you can read in something else to it, but that's not what's there. That's not the intention. That's not the purpose. And things that I think, when we talk about, revisiting previous decisions, I think what this exposes, if you assume that we all have the same interpretation of the text of Article 6, of course, then it becomes problematic if we revisit that. We don't view it as, revisiting previous decisions. We view it as this exposes different understandings of the same decisions. And the removals is there are of course things in Article 6.4 text outside of the recommendations that we didn't agree with completely, but those were not the major linchpins in our concerns about approving, moving forward with Article 6.4. It was most centrally removals, secondarily other aspects of that. And of course, other parties are going to feel different about that. I completely understand that. And I think there's obviously some strong feelings and emotions about that from some parties, absolutely. And we completely respect their views. So we don't want to diminish that. But knowing from where we're coming from, this is driven from a place of environmental integrity. And we reached a point in the negotiations when we realized that we weren't going to get significant concessions in areas that we felt were important, where we in the EU meetings internally said, okay, well, if we aren't going to able to get the deal we need in terms of, when it comes to removals, for example, then it's better to have no deal than a bad deal, because a bad deal is going to institutionalize practices that we believe are going to undermine the market in the long run.
Thank you, David. So I'd like to give the floor to Dirk. I know that Lisa is also waiting for a while also to address a question here in the chat, but since Dirk raised his hand, if you want to jump in.
I was actually going to defer to Lisa if you want to jump in, because you were closer to some of this than I was. I was just going to comment on how ridiculous I think it was that the EU used the voluntary carbon market as its rationale. If they're worried about the voluntary carbon market, they're worried about the wrong thing. This is about compliance markets, and that's where the action needs to shift. And before people complained about the voluntary carbon market, they complained about, guess what? The Kyoto Protocol mechanisms. There's always room for improvement, right? And the voluntary carbon market is undergoing an enormous overhaul right now that you guys could have confidence in rather than taking pot shots at it. So, and what's particularly annoying is that some of the EU experts are involved in the ICBCM. And then when they don't get what they want there, they try to torque the negotiations to get it. So I think there's a lot of reflection that needs to be done. But Lisa, to you.
Thanks, Dirk. Strong echo on everything you've just said. And there's just a couple of things I want to touch base on or really highlight. Really interesting to note that the environmental integrity group of negotiators was strongly in favor of approving the guidance. And They have historically been the most strident and stringent in terms of environmental integrity. And then secondly, in terms of the sentiment, don't rush, it's in complete contravention of the IPCC's sixth assessment report, which says 2030 is a key date. We have to do as much as we can, as fast as we can. And it was very interesting to me in the final minutes of the negotiation that the African group of nations stood up and strongly supported the mechanism. And who's the most vulnerable? Who has the most to lose? Is it a westernized series of countries, or is it the African group of nations? Is it really, truly worth the perfection is worth the enemy of the good approach that we saw in the room? And I will say just one little anecdote. It was very clear to me that the negotiating strategy was less than in good faith at all times. At one point, we had one of the negotiators recite a defined, clear speech on the objection to the 6.4 text when we were talking about the 6.8 text. It was to the point of ridicule and really unfortunate. So perfection, in my view, is definitely the enemy of the good. The compliance market is, the voluntary market is 5% of the overall market. And we missed the opportunity to actually implement strong standards for what we need most. Not emission reductions right now, but removals. Actual sinks and associated atmospheric removals to help us meet that 2030 target. To say that's associated with environmental integrity is very difficult for me to stomach after all these years in the market. But let me leave it there. I apologize. I have to hop on to another event.
Thank you, Lisa. So, Audrey, we are running out of time. So if you want to comment about anything and also provide your final reflections, please.
I'll be very, very quick. I think actually it was more of a final reflection to start with anyway, but I think we've seen that clearly nobody expected this year to be so politicized. And there's clearly very strong opinions and discording opinions. What I feel is unfortunate is the fact that we get to a situation where some of those strong opinions only appear at the very last moment and take everybody kind of hostage and blocking the process. I think it would be interesting to see going into the new year and to the next COP, what can be done so that those confronting opinions are voiced earlier on and can be worked on earlier on so that an agreement and a consensus can be achieved. I think it's about finding a way to build rather than destroy just on the basis that it's not good enough. Thank you.
Thank you, Audrey. Andrea, would like to comment?
Yeah, I think I wanted to make a final remark along the same line as Audrey. The 6.4 mechanism has been delayed by at least 1 year. We hope there will be trust in the process going forward, and it will not be perceived as too unreliable to businesses. But also we have 6.2, and so I think it's in everyone's interest to go past this acrimony and try and build a market that delivers some environmental integrity. Because, well, blocking the 6.4 does not block markets altogether. And we've always seen a 6.4 as a tool to raise the bar on quality. So I think we need that process to continue and to not be broken.
Thank you, Andrea. I completely agree with you and Audrey. So I would like to provide space for final reflections from Olga, David, and Dirk. If you want to comment on anything really quickly.
I did mine, so I'm happy.
Okay, Olga, please.
Yes, I'd be happy to, and I apologize. I feel very passionate because we are delayed. I'm sorry, David. I didn't mean it personally. We are delayed, guys. You know, we need to make sure that there is there is finance that's provided to the most critical mitigation out there. We don't have the time. That's why it's so strange to hear that this is done in the name of environmental integrity. But we need, in order for us to trust the EU's intention, we need to see action from the EU, because we don't see it. We don't see EU using mechanisms. We see other countries using mechanisms and trying to make it workable, and investing money and working together with countries, working together with projects, right? We don't see that in the EU, from the EU, and I think in order for the trust to be back in Article 6 room, we need to see EU as a partner on equal footing with others, also trying to do things.
Thank you. I really appreciate from Olga and Dirk and others here the engagement and the desire to make this work. I think that kind of passion and engagement is really needed for this, because it is a really difficult area that we're trying to work this out together. Absolutely. And so I really respect that. And I think we need exactly that kind of thing to get us over the finish line in these areas. I can mention that Sweden actually is engaged in Article 6 too. We have bilateral agreements moving forward in place, negotiating new ones. We have, it's 150 million US that we're using, that the government of Sweden alone is using to engage in Article 6. We've signed our first MOPA in Ghana recently. We have a vested interest in making sure that this happens. So unlike maybe some other EU countries, we have a vested interest in actually the outcomes of this. We want to see it work. And I think that's really important to mention here. And so I think, moving forward, I think, it can be questioned, what are the EU's motives behind this? You can question whether we're negotiating in good faith. And from where I've sat, unless there were discussions going behind closed doors that I was unaware of that did not reflect our position, that's not what I observed. The good faith negotiations were there. It's just that we did have some red lines when it came to the removals guidance, for example. And those red lines, we were not willing to compromise on those. And that's where you see the intransigence coming, if you frame it as intransigence. And so I think moving forward, what we need to do is to explore the reasonings, the goals and the reasonings that we have behind the positions that we do, whether it's the EU, whether it's the US on authorization, how do you find a cooperative approach? I think we need to get to the bottom of what are the main goals and driving factors, because then I think we can start creating consensus based on those values, instead of just starting points as the positions themselves, because there's usually interests and values underlying those positions. And so I look forward to working with my colleagues on this. Again, I really appreciate the passion and engagement. I think it's absolutely necessary. So I'm glad to see it. Thank you.
Thank you, David and Olga. I think this was a really insightful discussion, and thank you also the audience for such an engagement through the chat. I know that eventually there were some questions that we couldn't address, but I hope this was a discussion that you enjoyed as much as I enjoyed, and I hope to see this passion over this next year for us to reach a different outcome in next COP. So I expect that now you can rest a bit, recharge your energy for the coming year, and I would like to say happy holidays, and let's keep positive and optimistic for the next year to make a difference in carbon markets. I'm sure that we will be able to reach a different outcome at next COP. Thank you all.